Hey everyone! By now you've probably heard the news that Sony has released firmware version 2.0 for the FX6. Now normally I don't get too excited about firmware updates because usually those updates just fix some bugs or add some minor new features that I may or may not even care about. But this free firmware update is very different. Version 2.0 really is something that every FX6 owner should be very excited about, and I suggest you install it on your camera as soon as possible. Now, I've been shooting with a beta version of 2.0 for about a week now, and it has already radically changed how I shoot with my camera. In fact, 2.0 is such a major upgrade for the FX6 that I've decided that I need to add another chapter to my 7-hour FX6 masterclass that addresses these new features in detail. So I'm already working on that new video, and if all goes well, I expect to release chapter 27 later this month, so stay tuned. In the meantime, I just want to take a few minutes right now to briefly talk about the highlights of version 2.0 so you have a better idea of why I think this update is so great and why you need to install it on your camera as soon as you can. Now, there are about a dozen changes worth mentioning, so let's go down the list. First of all, in my opinion, the #1 best new feature is picture cache. Picture cache has been an integral part of many Sony cameras for more than a decade, but until now, the FX6 did not have a picture cache function. Now, picture cache is very useful when you know in advance that you won't have very much warning before something happens that you need to capture. Now, for example, you might find yourself waiting for ice to calve off a glacier, a meeting to begin, or in my case, when I was out shooting this past weekend, this osprey sitting on a branch waiting to take flight. Now, experience tells me he might sit there for an hour or more, and it doesn't make sense for me just to let the camera roll and roll and roll, hoping that he takes off before the memory card fills up, and then afterwards having to ingest and deal with tons of useless footage in post. So picture cache is a much more efficient way of getting the shot. With picture cache turned on and the FX6 in standby mode, up to 31 seconds of full-blown 4K video and audio is constantly being buffered in the camcorder's memory. That means that everything that happens up to 31 seconds before the record button is pressed can be captured and saved onto the memory card. Now, not only is the footage that was in the buffer captured, but the camera continues to record normally from that point forward for as long as you want until you decide to stop it. So in the case of the osprey, I just aimed the camera, waited until he took flight, and then I pressed the record button to capture that key moment onto the memory card. I didn't miss the shot, and I only rolled off about 45 seconds of footage, even though I had to wait about 15 minutes. Perfect. But here's where it gets very interesting, because the FX6 can do something no other Sony camera has ever been able to do before, and that is the ability to use picture cache and S&Q motion simultaneously. Now, if you're an astute observer, you may have noticed that when I shot the osprey, the camera was set up to record at 120 frames per second slow motion, with picture cache turned on. This is a huge game changer for people like me who frequently shoot slow motion footage of wildlife, aerospace, sports, and other unpredictable subject matter where we'd like to use picture cache and S&Q motion at the same time. I'll take a deeper dive into this topic in Chapter 27 of my masterclass. The second most important new feature of version 2.0 is almost as earth-shattering as picture cache, and that is touch tracking autofocus. That's not Sony's official name for it on the FX6, but touch tracking or subject tracking is the terminology I prefer to use. Now, as you know, the FX6 has always had amazing face eye detect autofocus that is almost infallible when you're shooting human beings. But for most other subjects, things that are not people's faces, the performance of autofocus left a lot to be desired. But that all changes in version 2.0 with Sony's amazing AI-based real-time autofocus tracking. Now, all I have to do is tap anywhere on the touchscreen LCD to tell the camera exactly where I want it to focus, and it does so instantly. And then, this is where it gets really good, the camera will continue to track that subject wherever it moves in the frame. Watch as I swing the camera around on this bird, and the tracking box pretty much stays right in the same place. The camera's ability to track fast-moving subjects is nothing short of amazing, and it definitely makes my job easier. I mean, I consider myself pretty good at being able to follow focus manually on moving targets, but I'm not ashamed to admit that the FX6 is the first camera I've owned that can consistently do it better. I've only had the subject tracking mode on my camera for a few days now, and I've already been able to capture a few cool shots that would have been very difficult, if not impossible, without it. I'll talk more about my suggested autofocus menu settings and how to use them for maximum performance in my upcoming video. But just to give you a teaser, I now have my FX6 configured so that I always have 3 methods of focusing available to me at all times, without ever having to stop and change any menu settings or fumble with switches. First, I have full manual focus control all the time, which means I can focus manually by turning the focus ring on the lens, and then the camera will stay focused exactly where I want it with no chance of it overriding my choice. Second, I can press any of the push auto buttons on my camera or the lens to tell the FX6 to instantly focus on whatever is at the center of the frame, and it will continue to track focus at the center of the frame until I release the button, and then the lens will return to full manual focus. And now with version 2.0, I have a third way of focusing. All I have to do is tap anywhere on the camera's LCD monitor to activate the subject tracking mode. And then the camera will take over and track almost any subject. If it moves, the FX6 can track it. To exit the subject tracking mode at any time, all I have to do is turn the focus ring of the lens and back to full manual focus mode instantly. Now, subject tracking takes some practice to get the hang of, and it isn't 100% perfect, but it's pretty damn close. In fact, to go one step further, I also have my FX6 set up so that if the camera detects a human face while it's running in the subject tracking mode, it will immediately shift over to the face eye detect mode, which is even more accurate and foolproof when shooting people. Another cool feature of version 2.0 is called breathing compensation. Now, even if you're not familiar with the term breathing, I'm sure you've seen its unwanted effects but didn't know it had a name. Breathing refers to the shifting of either the angle of view or the focal length of a lens when the focus is changed. Here's an example. Watch the edges of the frame when I rack focus back and forth between the wall and the fountain with my Sony 85mm lens. Notice how much the edges of the frame are changing, almost as if the lens is being zoomed, even though it's not a zoom lens. That is called breathing, and it is an unwanted side effect when you're trying to shoot the best possible images. Many high-end cinema lenses exhibit very little breathing, or none at all, but breathing can be a real problem with the sort of lightweight, inexpensive autofocus lenses that a lot of us use with our FX6. So with breathing compensation turned on, watch what a difference it makes. There is virtually no change now to the edges of the frame when the focus is racked back and forth. Now, breathing compensation requires the use of a compatible lens, and it's not something you'll want to leave turned on all the time. So we'll take a closer look at the pros and cons of breathing compensation and which lenses are compatible in Chapter 27. Next, if you're interested in recording 16-bit RAW video with your FX6 connected to a third-party external recorder, you'll be pleased to know that now you can output a RAW signal over HDMI. As you know, the FX6 has always been able to provide a raw output signal via SDI, but adding an HDMI option means that the FX6 can be used with a greater number of external recorders without the need for an SDI converter. You may have already noticed that version 2.0 also brings a much requested change to how audio meters are displayed in the viewfinder. Instead of just showing channels 1 and 2 down in the corner, now all 4 channels of audio are displayed all of the time. And speaking of audio, if you have your camera set up to record proxy files, you'll be happy to know that those files will now contain metadata for all 4 channels of audio, so that the audio channel count between the main clip and the proxy file matches when you conform the footage in post. But just to be clear, let me emphasize that the camera still only records 2 channels of audio with proxy files. The only thing that is different is the metadata. The new firmware increases the number of settings that can be changed via the LCD touch panel. And you also have an option now to assign the camera's multifunction dial mode to the assignable dial on the grip. If you use the networking capabilities of the FX6, you'll be glad to know that FTP transfer speed has been enhanced with version 2.0. And I should note that if you use Sony's Content Browser mobile app, you'll need to get an update. Version 3.6 or higher will be required after upgrading your FX6 to the new firmware. Another change is found with the camera's simultaneous recording mode. There's now a couple of new options. You can now start recording on one card by pressing the record button on the camera body, or start recording on the other card by pressing the record button on the handle. For example, you might want to record interviews on the card in slot A and B-roll on the card in slot B. The camera offers two options that allow you to designate which button will activate recording on which card. Next, there's a couple of new features that are designed to make HDR productions easier to produce. First, there's a SDR emulated preview display mode for the LCD panel that functions kind of like a monitor LUT. And second, if you do use that mode, the camera will record the gain setting as part of the clip's metadata. So if you change the camera's gain setting to make the image you see on the LCD monitor brighter or darker during shooting, that information is now stored in the metadata so it can be retrieved automatically in post. The final new feature worth noting is a creative shooting function called the bokeh control mode. If you're not familiar with the term bokeh, it refers to the aesthetic quality of the blur produced in the out-of-focus parts of an image. For example, in this shot of the scrub jay, the areas to the sides and behind the bird are where we want to see nice out-of-focus bokeh to help the subject stand out from what would otherwise be a very cluttered background. The aperture of the lens is what determines the bokeh, so one technique of deliberately accentuating the lens bokeh is to shoot with a wide open aperture, thus using shallow depth of field to create images that have prominent out-of-focus regions. In fact, the ability to obtain super shallow depth of field is one of the main advantages of cameras such as the FX6 that have full-frame sensors. So the purpose of the bokeh control mode was to allow you to vary the depth of field by opening or closing the iris of the lens while you're recording without changing the overall exposure. For example, watch as I change the iris of my lens to increase the depth of field. And you'll notice that rather than the picture getting darker, the camera maintains the same exposure by automatically adjusting the variable ND, or in some cases the ISO gain, to compensate for the loss of light. This is a cool feature that will allow you to shoot some creative shots that would be nearly impossible to do with other cameras. So those are the major upgrades to the FX6 that come with Firmware 2.0. As I said, I'll be releasing a new chapter for my masterclass later this month that goes into more detail on how to use those features, so keep an eye out for it. In the meantime, I recommend you go ahead and do the firmware update, and I'll see you in the next video. Happy shooting.